So coming up in our final part of Lecture 3, what our ethical guidelines look like when we take account of Indigenous people.
Shut up and sit down.
Okay, so this is part 6 of Lecture 3, final part of Lecture 3. It's been a big old lecture series, this one, but no wonder given the importance of thinking about how we can engage in research that does no further harm and perhaps does some good for Indigenous people. So, there are 2 sets of formal guidelines on research with Indigenous people in Australia. The first covers all research involving human participants, which is the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. And in addition to this document, we have a set of ethical guidelines specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This is called the Values and Ethics Guidelines for Ethical Conduct in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Research. This document has also been translated into a user-friendly guide for Aboriginal people to empower them to have a greater voice in any research that they're part of. Now, this National Statement on Ethical Conduct has 4 key elements: respect, integrity and research merit, beneficence and justice. Now, the Values and Ethics document has 6 key principles, many of which we've spoken about throughout this lecture series in terms of reciprocity and respect. Now, the importance of spirit and connectedness is also there too. Now, sorry, I'm sweating away. It's less than 30 degrees outside, but for some reason, it's still baking hot inside here. Anyway, yeah, so things are quite normal. Okay, so one of the things that can be challenging when we're talking about the detail of what we need to do in our particular piece of research is trying to apply these broad umbrella documents. It can be quite hard to think of the practical application of these broad principles. But there are a couple of great guides to help us with that. The first was written by the Louix Institute. It takes you through establishing relationships, collecting data and analysis, and it has got some great practical examples of what that actually looks like in the field. Now, the second is the 10 principles relevant to health research with Indigenous Australians, which was developed by Lisa Jameson and her colleagues. It's quite helpful to look at that one in a bit more detail, so I'll do that now.
Which is...
Details.
Now, I've included a copy of all these documents under the Moodle tab for this week. If you're not enrolled in this unit, obviously you'll not get access to them, so just do your own Googling, as they say. So here we go. Principle 1. Addressing a priority health issue as determined by the community requires that researchers work as equal partners with the community at all phases of the research process to ensure their own objectives and ideas.
Your ideas. I know.
Don't overshadow the community's own priority areas. Principle 2. Conducting research within a mutually respectful partnership.
I don't respect you nearly enough to have that conversation.
Partnership framework, sorry. This encourages the development of an open and transparent relationship which engages with key champions for a study to ensure that the work is supported and that the research is based in local governance systems. Now, this takes a lot of time, but is essential for research success. Creating partnerships includes committing to continue the work after the study has formally ended. The formal funding has run out for the study.
Never ends.
Now, principle 3, capacity building. This is a key focus of the research partnership within sufficient budget. Make sure it stays within a sufficient budget to support this. Investigators need to commit to employing Indigenous staff and provide opportunities for the staff to develop their research careers. The budget also needs to be realistically costed to address some of the common challenges, for example, for personnel costs, including allowances for staff turnover, longer times for recruitment, as well as funding for extended community engagement and unforeseen changes, such as more trips or trips being rescheduled because of cultural-based delays. So basically, the budget has to be a bit more flexible, or at least you need to budget in for more than you might ordinarily would, because of the difficulties that sometimes occurs with community engagement and engaging with Indigenous communities in particular. Now, Principle 4, flexibility in study implementation while maintaining scientific rigour. So flexible study implementation relates to adjusting things like the study protocol based on feedback from the community.
I'm, flexible.
And research shows that health interventions are most effective when there is involvement of community members in their development and implementation. Otherwise, they're likely to result in no discernible effects.
Largely arid, no discernible life, no surprises.
Principle 5, respecting communities past and present in terms of their experience of research. Now, many Aboriginal Australians have very negative experiences of researchers, and it's important to bear this in mind when you're conducting community consultation and incorporating this understanding into your communication with people. Research needs to be ready for communities to say no to at any point.
A guy puts the no thanks and thanks but no thanks.
The research must also be of a high standard to ensure that it will generate meaningful results and contribute to better health outcomes. In the past year, people have just swooped in Indigenous communities, and Indigenous communities have had pretty poor experiences with researchers, either researchers engaged in looking at issues that are not relevant to the community, or doing research badly, or there being other bad outcomes of the research. So bear in mind that when you're working with Indigenous communities, they may have had a series of bad experiences in relation to researchers coming into their community. Now, Principle 6, recognising the diversity of Indigenous Australian populations. Now, there's an immense diversity within the Aboriginal community, and this needs to be taken into account when implementing research, such as national level studies that will include different language and culturally distinct groups. Principle 7, ensuring extended timelines do not jeopardise projects. Aboriginal health research might need more time due to more complex ethical approval processes. Delays can occur at any stage and may include unforeseen community-based events, longer periods of participation recruitment times, also unforeseen weather events and difficulties in securing appropriate travel and accommodation. Some communities are quite remote. Principle 8, preparing for Indigenous leadership turnover. Aboriginal leaders are put under a lot of pressure, and therefore there's a high Indigenous leader turnover. It's important for researchers to account for this by not solely basing their research contacts on a couple of leaders, and be prepared to spend even years building strong relationships with a number of local leaders. Now, the awful thing is here that because life expectancy of Aboriginal people is still so much lower than it is for non-Aboriginal, non-Indigenous people, the truth of it is the leaders can die off before your study's finished. I mean, it's appalling. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about closing the gap. There's a huge gap in life expectancy between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. It's a bit of a shocker. Okay, Principle 9, supporting community ownership. So projects can only be sustainable when the community has sufficient input and ownership over the project. And from the outset, research projects need to be direct and relevant to Aboriginal communities. Directly relevant, sorry. Ideally, doing so by forming Aboriginal advisory committees where possible, and by researchers constantly reviewing their research with these committees and with Aboriginal staff, or with staff and community members if an advisory committee isn't possible. And finally, Principle 10, developing systems to facilitate partnership management in multi-centre studies requires developing transparent agreements for managing partnerships. Now, there are a couple of interesting differences between Jamesons Principles and the MHMRC guidelines on values and ethics. Jameson takes a more positive approach in promoting ethical practices, whereas the NHMRC guidelines are much more about preventing unethical practices. The NHMRC document very much adopts a kind of Anglo-European approach, whereas Jameson's work builds into the principles the importance of beginning with Aboriginal values about research. So Jameson adopts a kind of bottom-up approach, starting with the ethics and knowledge systems of Indigenous people, and responding to local needs, whereas the NHMRC starts with a top-down approach, starting with the principles that are already adopted under Anglo-European research, those basic ethical principles, and starting with those and then maybe adapting them to local community needs, but it's very much top-down. So the focus is on such things as, doing no harm.
Well, wouldn't do no harm.
And these things are decided prior to working with Indigenous communities. Now, the application of these principles is governed through the submission of an ethics application for review by a Human Research Ethics Committee, which we discussed in a previous lecture. Now, applications for research with Aboriginal Australians are automatically reviewed as high risk, and there are a number of aspects that you must respond to in your ethics application. Typically, the committee that looks at your application will include Aboriginal representatives. Now, let's have a think about what we mean by high risk and risk in general. One thing that can be confusing for people new to research is understanding the role of ethics and the separation of low and high risk projects. So I just said that research with Aboriginal Australians and other Indigenous Australians is automatically assessed as a high-risk project. This is because with things that we've outlined in this lecture series, there's a long history of not merely negative but actively detrimental destructive research within psychology and other disciplines in relation to Aboriginal Australians.
Are you Aborigines?
So this is a community that's been heavily marginalised, and psychology has been doing a fair bit of the marginalising. So that's one of the reasons it's high-risk research for us in psychology. Now, the research in psychology in the past has contributed to the trauma experienced by Indigenous people. However, risks are something that you need to consider in all research projects. The guidelines identify 3 levels of risk. So harm, we have risk of harm, risk of discomfort, and inconvenience. So here we've got some examples of risks to give you a better idea of these 3 different types of risks. So harm would be physical harm as well as psychological harm. So if you are undertaking socially sensitive research, you need to be careful not to make participants feel devalued or disrespected. There might also be social harm, which is damage to people's social relationships or ability to access services. So if you talk to people about, say, their use of mental health services and those people are critical of the services, how do you manage the risk of that person or those people then not getting the same access to those services? The service provider gets a little bit peed off by the fact that these guys are complaining, so it decides to restrict their access to the service. How do you manage that risk? There can also be economic harm and legal harm. So economic harm would be where people are out of pocket as a result of your research, for example, travel expenses, but also there's threats to income. So if you're working with unemployed people and your research shows how some people are not looking for work, those people might have their welfare benefits withdrawn, where welfare benefits are given on the basis that people are actively seeking work.
You must continue to look for work, or your benefit payments will be frozen.
There must be some mistake.
This has happened in the past. It's a real danger that your research can actually lead to a reduction in the participants' income and a reduction in their welfare benefits, or even having their welfare benefits shut down completely. Criminal harm would be where people disclose information that might lead to their criminal conviction. Now, where there are risks of harm, your project will likely be deemed high risk, and you'll be subject to a much more stringent ethics application as a result. High-risk applications usually go to a full ethics committee, whereas low-risk applications usually go to a subset of a committee, or sometimes can be decided by a chair or a nominee of a committee. So low risk are associated to these 2 other levels of risk. So these are the levels of risk that you'll be dealing with in research for an honours degree, or should be sticking to these 2 levels of risk. Apologies, my phone is just pinging. There you go. Ignore it. It's hard to ignore it, and I've drawn attention to it. I always do, don't I? I should just talk through it and maybe just pretend that it's your phone and everything's fine my end. Maybe I'll do that in future. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Inside voice, Paul. Inside voice. Okay. Anyway, back to the point. Getting distracted by my distraction there. So with your honours projects or projects that you're dealing with early on in your career when you are just starting out and doing research, if you're not an experienced researcher, you'd be encouraged to stay away from high-risk projects that could lead to harm, and stick with low-risk projects. And these are the risks of discomfort and inconvenience. So discomfort and inconvenience are usually deemed low risk.
I'm talking about a major inconvenience.
So these are the ethical issues you'll be dealing with for this unit. In assessment 3, I'm asking you to develop a research proposal that only really deals with low risk issues. It's a low risk project, and then you have to reflect on the ethical risks, and those will be low risk ethical issues.
Do you have any idea of the risk?
So discomfort might be anxiety that's induced by an interview. For example, talking about a sensitive topic that might cause embarrassment, or disclosing views that are not commonly held.
That is an awkward situation, indeed.
And research can also be inconvenient, asking people to do something they would not ordinarily do, to depart from their planned routine. So we have to manage all these various risks when we're planning our research, and we have to incorporate this risk management in the design of our research projects. So in research with Indigenous Australians, we would be making sure we cover all the ethical guidelines that I've outlined before. We'd need to demonstrate, in addition to this, we'd need to demonstrate community involvement, that our project involves in the Indigenous community, and having written agreements and reciprocal processes in place, and show a clear respect for community connections and so on. So these are the things you'd have to demonstrate in an ethics application involving Indigenous people. So these are additional things that you would ordinarily see in an ethics application for an otherwise high-risk project. Now, there are other management strategies in managing risks. One of the major ones is providing clear information to people about your research. Who you are, what you're going to do with the data, what they might be asked to do as part of the research, and how you'll work with them in the research process, including the writing up of the research. The companion site for your textbook has some really good examples of information statements that they used in the past in more sensitive projects. These will give you some good ideas for what type of information we provide to people and how we protect people's anonymity and right to withdraw and so on. Now, in weeks 1 and 3, we talked about researching alongside people from the community throughout your research project, right from the conceptualization to disseminating the results, to ensure that the research is beneficial for the community and is conducted respectfully. And we also talked in previous lectures of the importance of developing skills for working with more sensitive issues and populations. And if you're new to research, you won't have these skills yet. So those will be skills you'll be developing as you get more experience in doing research. Now, another important way to minimize risks to participants is to have resources to share with people, for the people participating in the research in case they get distressed. Often we provide information for accessing specialist counselling services when we're researching socially sensitive topics. And a very simple but important management strategy is making any forms you use relevant, short and simple. So that is, we're seeking to minimize the impact of the research on people's time.
You're wasting my time.
Now, you need to be thinking about the low risk issues for assessment 3, where you're going to write a research proposal. Remember, you need to keep your project low risk. So you'll only be dealing with risks of inconvenience and discomfort. No harm, okay? Stay away from harm. Now, even though in this course we're not developing research questions and proposals for work with Aboriginal Australians or Torres Strait Islander Australians, there's much to be learned and applied from what we've studied here in this lecture, in these series of lectures, to apply it to qualitative research methods. There's always the likelihood, though, that even if you've not got a project that's focused on an Indigenous community, that you may get participants in your project who are Indigenous people. So it's always good to know this stuff in advance, okay? Now, what we learned from thinking about the ethical issues involved in researching with Indigenous people is the importance of critiquing psychological concepts and practices, particularly those that lead to pathologizing people. We also learn about approaching research as a relationship, not something that is done to participants. We learn about letting go of our own worldview and being curious about someone else's worldview, no matter how different that might be to ours. And we learn to think of research as not just about gathering data, but as part of a community and social change process. And we also learn that to ensure that our research is safe for our participants. Now, here are some future resources. Have a look at this page when you download the PowerPoint file from Moodle, or if you're not enrolled on the unit, pause the video just now, take a note of this stuff. So that concludes lecture series 3. Wow, that was a big old lecture series, eh? We now move on to lecture series 4, which begins in teaching week 7. So till then, ta-ta.